The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Africa is a land with endless stories to tell. From epic battles, brilliant rulers, and the dramatic rise and fall of civilizations. Join us on the History of Africa podcast to learn the oft-ignored stories of the African continent. From the sands of Cairo to the plains of Zimbabwe, and from the mountains of Ethiopia to the forests of the Congo. Find the History of Africa podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is Season 5, Vulgar History Internationàle, Scandaliciousness Without Borders, Tits Out, Sans Frontières. So inspired by all of the different places that listeners are listening from, and by my interest in wanting to learn more about parts of the world that are not Tudor England, we're looking at a variety of different places, and this week we are going to I guess we start on the Iberian Peninsula, and then we get into North Africa, Morocco, and we're telling the story of a woman who is known as Sayyida al-Hurra, and I say she's known as that because that's not her name. I'm going to explain that in a moment, but first, big shout out to Tits Out Brigade member Bella, who suggested this as a person to profile, and then who also has been super helpful, just helping me find some really good resources to learn more about North African and Moroccan history. Thank you so much, Bella. So some of the sources that I looked at, and they're all listed in the show notes. There's an article by Tom Verde on aramcoworld.com, an article by Austin Bodetti on InsideArabia.com, Britannica.com, and then a few books, including The Forgotten Queens of Islam by Fatima Marnisi, and A History of Islam and 21 Women by Hossein Kamali. And again, all the links will be there in the show notes, so you can, if you want to fact check me, because this is another one where it's like, there's, not unlike the story of Didda of Kashmir, there's not a whole lot of sources. Like there's not a whole lot of people at the time writing a whole bunch of different things. Like there's like a number of historical records, and then everyone who writes about it are kind of all looking at the same stuff, and just so the stuff I was looking at were people who were interpreting that or explaining that, again, because I only speak and read English, so I'm really depending on people who read this stuff and know a lot more about the broader cultural context. So the story begins on the Iberian Peninsula, which is a phrase that means basically the big square sticking out of the left side of Western Europe. Like right now, if you look at a map, it's like, oh, that's where Spain and Portugal are, just like that big land mass. So we've talked about people before from parts of this peninsula, like Inés de Castro. Or in previous seasons, we looked at Isabel of Portugal, Isabella of Castile, Juana of Castile. But before any of those people were there, the whole peninsula was under Muslim rule for 800 years, starting in the year 711, so I guess before, it's like, it just keeps changing who's in charge of it. So before the Muslims were there, it was the Visigoths were there, and they were Christian people, and they called it Hispania, like the whole peninsula. The Arabic word for this peninsula was /is al-Andalus. So it's going back and forth between who's in charge of it, and it's very much a religious, cultural based battle. So just a little brief history lesson to understand what things were like when in this like 800-year period, and kind of like the medieval era where it was under Muslim rule. So the city of Cordoba, which was at that time the largest city in Europe, became one of the leading cultural and economic centers anywhere, well, in that area, like Europe. Achievements that advanced Islamic and Western science came from Al-Andalus, including major advances in trigonometry, astronomy, surgery, and pharmacology. Al-Andalus became a major educational center for Europe and the lands around the Mediterranean Sea, as well as a conduit for cultural and scientific exchange between the Islamic and Christian worlds. So although Al-Andalus was a Muslim-ruled kingdom, Christian people and Jewish people were permitted to live there so long as they paid a special tax, which by paying that tax, they were then permitted to practice their religion and were offered the same level of protections as Muslim people. That being said, for much of its history, Al-Andalus existed in conflict with Christian kingdoms to the north. For a time, God, this is just like I got a book out from the library that was like the historical atlas of the Islamic world. So I've just been like studying up like who is in charge of what. But ultimately, so Cordoba fell in 1236. It was conquered by Christians, and then most of the south started falling as well. And then Granada, which is like at the south part of the peninsula, was left as the last Muslim state on the Iberian Peninsula. You might remember the name Granada because that was mentioned in the episode on Isabella and Ferdinand, or Isabella of Isabella and Ferdinand. So they were the Catholic monarchs, and their whole thing was they finished the Reconquista, which is the name meaning like reconquest, like taking the peninsula, quote unquote, back for Christian people. And so that was like a battle that had been going on for hundreds of years, but it was Isabella and Ferdinand who finished it when they forced the surrender of Granada, which was then annexed into Castile, and then that made the entire peninsula now under Catholic control. So that was 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus headed out to do various genocidal things. So our heroine this week was born in Granada very shortly before it fell. So she was probably around like 5-7 years old around the time that Isabella and Ferdinand captured Granada. And so she, little girl, along with her family and thousands of other refugees, fled Granada to go and live in North Africa, where there were Islamic communities already there. As per the decree that expelled them, like Muslim people, from Granada. They were not permitted to take any valuables with them, meaning they had to leave all of their money, weapons, and horses behind. So, names. The woman we're talking about is best known as Sayyida al-Hurra, but it's very similar. Like, that is not the name that she was given by her parents. That is not a name she chose for herself. That is a title, and it is very similar to me to on Game of Thrones. And I hate how much I bring up Game of Thrones on this, but I guess that just really shows how much that show draws from actual historical stuff. But it's exactly like how on that show there was a character whose name was Daenerys Targaryen, but she became known as Khaleesi because that was the title when she married Khal Drogo. And then to the point that people just called her Khaleesi. Like, that was the name that, like, when people were talking about the show, they just called her Khaleesi. For a while, like, one of the popular baby names of, like, people, like, not book people, but, like, people in our world, like, Khaleesi was the name people were giving their daughter. So, similar to that, Sayyida al-Hurra is a title, not a name. It translates from Arabic to mean something like the free woman or the noble woman. So, that was her title. That was how she was known professionally. But the reason why she kind of is known as that is because most of the records we have about her are not from Muslim sources. They're from actually Spanish, Christian, and Portuguese people who were her enemies. And why would she be like, oh, hey, this is my name, like, good to meet you? Like, they just knew that's what she was called. So there are some suggestions that her, like, given name might have been Aisha, which is an Arabic name that means life or alive. But I had to make a judgment call here. This is the first time this season, but it will happen a couple more times where I just needed to figure out what am I going to call this person for the purposes of this podcast. In this case, I'm going to go with calling her Sayyida al-Hurra or just Sayyida because that is what most sources call her. I don't want to... That's how she's known. We don't know for sure if her name was Aisha, so I feel sort of uncomfortable using that name for her. But she, at least we know this was a title that she went by. So we're just going to, Sayyida is what we're going to call her. So, Sayyida was born around 1485 in Granada. Her father was, her family was the powerful, wealthy tribe, the Banu Rashid. Her father was a tribal chief, Muley Ali ibn Rashid. Her mother was Lala Zora Fernandez, who is a Christian convert to Islam. Sayyida had one brother we know of named Muley Ibrahim. He comes up again later. So the Rashids, her family, were a noble clan that claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad through Idris I, founder of Morocco's first Islamic dynasty. So just like a very prestigious family lineage. In terms of vulgar history and who else we've talked about at the same time, I already mentioned, so it was Isabella from Isabel and Ferdinand who was responsible ultimately for Sayyida and her family and like thousands of other Muslims being kicked out of Granada. So Sayyida was born about 10 years after Isabella became queen. In terms of just like the year she was born, this was also the same time, if you want to picture like who else was like alive, breathing the same oxygen as her, Juana of Castile, as well as Mary Tudor, Queen of France, were both born around the same time. So after fleeing Granada, Sayyida's family settled in the southeast of Tangier in northern Africa, where her father founded the city-state of Chefchaouen near Morocco's northern coast. So Sayyida's father founded the city to fight the Portuguese. So at this point, yes, they were kicked out by the Spanish, like the Catholic monarchs, but like Portuguese were also doing a lot of colonization, attacking Muslim people. So the city was founded to fight the Portuguese invasions of northern Morocco. So to kind of like have a home base to consolidate the rebellion or the opposition to that. So he opened the gates of the city to waves of fellow refugees fleeing the Reconquista, including not just Muslim people, but also Jewish people, as well as Moriscos, who were a group who were former Muslim people who had converted to Christianity, but Isabella and Ferdinand still didn't want them there, I guess. So Chefchaouen is today You might have heard of it, and I might be pronouncing the name wrong, but that's what it looks like. If you look it up on Instagram or on Pinterest, it is a very popular Instagram tourist destination. It's known as the Blue City because all the buildings and outdoor steps, etc., are all painted blue. It's very stunning in photography. That's a more recent thing, though. Sayyida's father wasn't like, I'm going to build this city and I'm going to paint it all blue, because they didn't care about tourism at that point. There's several theories as to why the walls were painted all blue in the city. One is that the blue keeps mosquitoes away. And personally, like as a person who mosquitoes prefer over all other humans, if that's true, I would wear all blue the rest of my life every summer. The blue also is said to perhaps symbolize the sky and heaven and serve as a reminder to lead a spiritual life. However, also there's a rumor that the walls were all mandated to be painted blue just to like make it be a tourist destination in like the 1970s. Anyway, it's a very, very, very photogenic and beautiful city, and it was invented by Sayyida's father. So, Sayyida and her brother grew up in Chefchaouen, and they were both provided with a really good education. She apparently, well, clearly based on her future life, she did very well learning various languages, including Castilian, which is Spanish, and Portuguese. She also learned, obviously, Arabic, probably some of the Berber languages that were of the indigenous people of that area. She also learned theology. So one of the reasons why, because we come across this in both ways, don't we? Like on this podcast, it's like, girls either get an education or girls don't get an education, and it's really dependent on culturally what their fathers kind of want to do, and their mothers sometimes. But anyway, at this time in this culture and era, the quest for knowledge was a marker of social distinction. So the fact that they were this very prestigious family, like of course their children would be educated as best as possible. Among her teachers was the famed Moroccan scholar Abdallah al-Ghazwani, whose father, the equally celebrated Sheikh Ujjal, allegedly once put his hand to Sayyida's head and declared, "This girl will rise high in rank." And whether that happened or not, guess what she did? So she was given this like formal education of like lessons, etc. But then I can't imagine she wouldn't have also grown up hearing her father and other adults around her talking about how they used to live in Granada, how they probably wanted to capture it again and or make the Spanish Christians pay for kicking them out of there. Like this was entirely like refugee founded city. So I think there's probably she would have grown up learning about what had happened to them and why. And yeah. So when she was around 15 years old, I think, she a marriage was arranged for her, and she married a man named Abu Hassan al-Mandari. This is a point of contention in every source that I looked at, where no one is quite sure if she married. There's two men with that name, and one was a man about 30 years older than her, and one was a man who was younger, and his relative, like that guy's son or that guy's nephew. And because they both have the same name, like nobody knows which one she married, but whichever one it was, he was at that time the governor of another North African Moroccan city called Tétouan. And so she married him, whichever one it was. And so she became like the first lady of Tétouan. So a note on Tétouan. This was a port city that had been destroyed about 100 years before this by the Portuguese. Why did the Portuguese destroy an entire city? Because, so I'm going to absolutely put maps on Instagram just so you can see kind of what this area is, how close everything is. So at the very tippy top of like North Africa, like right where North Africa almost is like touching the bottom of Spain, there's like a little sliver of it. And the Portuguese had a city there that is called Ceuta. And that they used because the Portuguese would like go to, quote, the New World and come back. And they really needed to have a port city for themselves right there. Tétouan was like just below that, but it was part of Morocco. It was not Portuguese, and the Portuguese didn't like how close Tétouan was to Ceuta, so they just kind of smashed it. And it was left abandoned for like 100 years. But Sayyida's husband was like, if I fix this all up, it can be a really great city for all these thousands of refugees from Al-Andalus, from Granada. And so like sort of like Chefchaouen. And also they could like revitalize it and maybe make it be like a port, and that would like help the like Moroccan situation. So that's what he did. So first he and presumably Sayyida went with him. They had to go to get permission from the Sultan of Morocco. So Morocco, again, there's like, Morocco is its own, I don't know if the word is technically a kingdom or just a country. It had its own sultan. Sultan of Morocco was Abu Abbas Ahmad ibn Muhammad, and he lived in Fez, which was the capital of Morocco. And this was totally separate from the Ottoman Empire, which is like further east, but also an Islamic empire. So Sayyida and her husband, who's either a lot older than her or not that much older than her, went to Fez to say, like, can we have permission to, like, what's that called? Like, Extreme Makeover Home Edition to Tetuan. And the Sultan was like, yeah, okay. And they also got permission to collect taxes to help pay for this city rejuvenation. And so Sayyida's husband oversaw Tetuan being all repaired. So the city walls were repaired, like a fort was put up, like the whole city was kind of put together over the course of something like 5 years. So it became a bustling metropolis with a great mosque and narrow maze-like streets to ward off invaders. And in fact, Old Town Tetuan is nowadays a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So because of how many people from Granada had fled to Northern Africa, and a lot of them went to Chefchaouen, and then a lot of them went to Tetuan when that became like livable. So Tetuan is often linked to Granada and is nicknamed Granada's daughter, because it's kind of like the community there just kind of like all moved all together. So it's sort of like, in, you know, like how there's like a Chinatown or something like in San Francisco and other places where it's like a bunch of people all move from one country to another country, but they all live together so they can make an area of that other country that's kind of like how the previous country was, where they can all speak their language and stuff. So at around the same time she married whichever of these two men she married, her brother, remember she has a brother, got a sweet gig being the vizier, which is like a chief minister / advisor to the Sultan of Morocco, which was the guy who gave them permission to rebuild Tetuan. And her father kept on governing Chefchaouen. So as a family, they were doing very well for themselves. They were all very powerful, influential, which was probably gratifying to them because they had gone from being this very powerful, influential family in Granada to being like refugees with no possessions, and now they're like on the come up again. So her husband clearly respected her. She was allowed to rule alongside him. Let's see. So again, just with the alliance of like Chefchaouen and Tetuan, like reflected by her marrying this guy, she and her family positioned themselves as major players in the effort to unify Morocco against the fast-growing powers of Spain and Portugal, / also the Ottoman Empire, which was kind of trying to take over Morocco, I think, as well. So now, culturally, this is interesting because a lot of this is like the flip side of Isabella from Isabel and Ferdinand, where she had such a sort of complex story of being like the underdog, and then she became queen, and then she started funding genocide, etc. But it was unusual for Isabella to have been a woman with that much power, and she was able to have that power because her husband was also the king, but she was a powerful woman leader, and she'd been queen for 10 years by the time Sayyida was born. So by the time Sayyida was like 15, 20 years old, like a married person, it was, Isabella had been queen for long enough that people were kind of like used to the concept of like a woman could be a queen, and that was okay, which might have helped pave the way for Sayyida to take on more responsibilities as the wife of the governor. So she served as kind of vice governor to her husband. Like when he went out of town, she was put in control, and people were okay with that, even though she was like, 19 years old. So an author who wrote about all of this, Hasna Lebedi, wrote, quote, Sayyida was trusted by her male relatives, and this seemed to be a feature of Andalusian Moroccan women in general. She knew what needed to be done under different circumstances, and these are the kinds of qualities that would have made her a leader. So all of this leads to her husband died just 5 years after they got married, and she seemingly, apparently without much drama, took over and became the governor. She just sort of inherited the job from him, and the population of Tetuan was like, love it, sure, this is great, like she's good, like let's just keep this sort of like handover of governorship and keep just like rebuilding and making Tetuan as cool as possible. So it was at this point when she became the governor that she took on the formal title of Sayyida al-Hurra, Akimat Tetuan, which means sovereign lady governor of Tetuan. So just the amount of power women had in this cultural moment. So Muslim women in this era, in these countries or these kingdoms, had more freedom comparatively than women under many Christian legal systems at the time. So, for instance, women in Islamic countries or kingdoms, like places like Tetuan or like the Ottoman Empire, they could divorce, they could keep their surnames after marriage, they could handle their own financial affairs. So there was already a bit more independence available for her as a woman. And so she became governor, and well, I guess I don't know how long, it depends which husband was her husband, but like in short order, like she surpassed him in prominence and kind of making Tetuan more of a force. So one of the challenges that he and then she had to face was it was hard to get grain, which you needed just for like trade, but also just for like to have food to eat, because there was not, the like land around Tetuan was not conducive to farming grain, so they had to figure out people who they could barter and trade with. But also the main thing is that Tetuan is and was a port city. So like every port city, like it was driven by a maritime economy, like people, ships coming, import, export, but also piracy, which we're going to get into. So it's not like Sayyida was the first person to figure out this is a way that to make the city work. She just kind of figured out how to make it work for them in this time and place. So like Tetuan had previously been a successful port-based town, like so successful that the Portuguese had smashed it all up 100 years ago. So she would have thought like, okay, how can we make this like work and thrive, but also not get smashed up by the Portuguese or by the Spanish? So the main thing that Tetuan had going for it, now that it was rebuilt, was it was the only major Moroccan port at the time that was not under Spanish or Portuguese control. So that meant that they could do a lot of trade with other Islamic places, like the entire Ottoman Empire. So this all leads to the whole legend of Sayyida al-Hurra as this kind of pirate princess. And that is definitely part of her legacy, but it's more complicated than that. So in the book, The History of Islam and 21 Women, the author Hossein Kamali writes, Portuguese and Spanish sources sought to stigmatize her by labeling her as a pirate. The line separating renegade pirates and legitimate navigators depends on one's perspective. One side's corsair, maybe another side's admiral. To describe her as a pirate or a pirate queen would be to misrepresent her. So let's have a little Pirates 101 lesson with special guest star Redbeard the pirate, aka Barbarossa. So there's just a lot of context that I personally needed to read up on to fully understand the context. So I'm going to explain stuff to you because I had to learn it for myself, and I'm going to share that with you. So in English language sources, the term the Barbary Coast was a name used from the 16th to 19th century in reference to the North African coast. Corsairs is a French word that means effectively privateers. So I grew up in Nova Scotia, so I know a lot about privateers because that's like the entire basis of the tourism industry in Nova Scotia. But just as a reminder for all of us, the difference between a pirate and a privateer is that a pirate is just generally a freelance person with a ship who just attacks other ships and steals their stuff. A privateer attacks ships and steals their stuff, but they aren't just doing that randomly. They're sponsored by a government or a corporation, and And so in the absence of a formal navy, or even for countries that had a formal navy, a lot of governments were just hiring privateers to just do this, because a lot of in this era of like beginning of European colonization, there was a lot of ship-based stuff going on. So like, for instance, Queen Elizabeth I hired privateers as well. She was not queen at this point, but like as an example of like kind of everyone kind of had to do that. Queen Elizabeth I's privateers were called the Sea Dogs. So put that together and you have the Barbary Corsairs. So this was a group of government-funded privateers who patrolled the coast of North Africa. So they were not necessarily, and often they weren't, people like of the Berber cultural ethnicity group. They were just people who were corsairs, privateers along the Barbary coast. So they would be hired out. They were also Islamic, I should mention, or at least they worked for Islamic governments. So a lot of them worked for the Ottoman Empire, which was the major Islamic power in that area at that time. It was all kind of like to the east of Morocco and around that side of the Mediterranean. And we're going to talk a lot about the Ottoman Empire in a different episode, so I'm not going to get into it too much today. But there were also corsairs who worked specifically for Morocco, and then like Tetuan would have its own specific corsairs who would work for them. So one very famous Barbary corsair was Oruç Reis, who was a Turkish man. Technically, he was born in Lesbos, which was at that point part of the Ottoman Empire. But he was a Turkish man who became known as Barbarossa, which is Italian for red beard. And he did have a red beard, but that's not why he was called that. And also, just side note, you might be like, I've heard of Barbarossa. You might be thinking of Barbossa, who is the character played by Jeffrey Rush in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, who was named after Barbarossa. Anyway, Barbarossa means red beard. And that's kind of a coincidence, because the reason why he was called that is he got the nickname Barbarossa because along with being a corsair, he also was just like a really good guy with the ship, and he was also just helpful. And so he helped resettle a lot of refugees fleeing Granada with his fleet of ships. And so people called him Baba Oruç. So his name was Oruç. Baba was a word that means kind of father. So it's kind of like, so he's called Baba Oruç because he's like Father Oruç, like the guy who's nice. And then just some European people misheard that as, what's that? Barbarossa? Because they saw, I guess he had a red beard. Anyway, that's the name he got, and he leaned into it because it became a very famous name. It's a very catchy name. It's a sort of thing where like, it's like, oh no, Barbarossa. It's like, I just rewatched The Princess Bride, which is like, honestly, a perfect movie. But it's like the whole thing with the Dread Pirate Roberts, where it's just like, I am Barbarossa. Like, people would just run away if they knew you're Barbarossa. So he leaned into the branding, although he didn't choose that name himself. Quick side note on Barbarossa in general. So Oruç was one of 4 brothers, and their father did pottery, and they had like a family-based pottery business. And the 4 brothers started out doing ship-based things because they were helping to like import-export pottery for the family pottery business. And I have to say, this is the most wholesome beginning of like a famous corsair that I've ever heard of. Eventually, Oruç and his brothers got the opportunity to switch to being a privateer, and I guess they just took that job opportunity. He was also, I feel like I read about so many people who are like, and this person, like he learned Italian, Spanish, French, Greek, and Arabic, as well as he was Turkish, so he obviously spoke that language too. But like, did everybody just speak all the languages then? Or am I just reading only about the people who did? Like, I'm impressed by that as a person who speaks one language, and also I can say like 12 words in French with an accent. So the brothers, they just kind of became more and more successful. Like, they were just good at being guys on ships, and then they became good at being corsairs. They were hired by the Ottoman Empire, so they were attacking Spanish and Portuguese ships, stealing back all the gold. Well, not back, but stealing the gold that the Spanish and Portuguese were stealing from the Aztecs and the Mayan people and other people in and around Central America. So, why am I talking about all this? I don't know how or why, because again, like the sources are like, there's not lots, but somehow Sayyida and Barbarossa connected, not romantically. Can you imagine? But I think they're just like two cool, successful people at this time, and they're like, let's find a way to work together. So they seem to have figured out a deal where they could just kind of divide up the corsair industry. So he focused on the Eastern Mediterranean so that Sayyida's corsairs could target, or Sayyida and her corsairs would be able to target European ships around the North Africa, Southern Iberian Peninsula area. So they weren't like duplicating work. They could just like corsair most effectively. Just to wrap up, because I just got really sidetracked personally in reading about this. So after Orich died, he obviously died in battle because that was the sort of life he lived. His brother Hayreddin inherited his role, like he inherited the fleet, and he also took on the name Barbarossa, and it was Hayreddin, so Barbarossa number 2. But also I think like if Barbarossa dies and someone else becomes Barbarossa, then it feels like Barbarossa never dies. And again, that's like Dread Pirate Roberts and The Princess Bride. Anyway, so Hayreddin became the most powerful and famous Ottoman admiral. He secured Ottoman dominance over the Mediterranean Sea. So when you hear about Barbarossa, it's probably Hayreddin, who was the one who kind of like took what Orich had done and like really took it to the next level. And if you're in Turkey, or if you have access to Turkish online television streaming services, there is a Turkish TV show called Barbaros, Sword of the Mediterranean, that's about the Barbarossa brothers. And I was like, that sounds so good, but it's like a Turkish TV show. I don't think I can watch it here in Canada. Anyway, back to Sayyida. So now that we all kind of know about corsairs and what they're up to, Sayyida. So did she literally get on these ships and literally attack other ships? Sometimes, probably, is my answer. So it's this sort of one of the reasons why what's known about her tends to end up being like an assumption of her as being a pirate, and that's like the main thing about her. And that's because most of the records that exist still are the Spanish and Portuguese records of her fleets attacking them. So there were like ledgers and stuff who were like, yep, so Sayyida al-Hurra, her forces attacked us. Like she was the one who like negotiate things. And kind of like how Barbarossa became just sort of like a name where you're like, oh fuck, it's Barbarossa, and people just like give up right away. It's like, oh my god, it's Sayyida al-Hurra, and people just give up. Like she became really famous by that name. So she would lead negotiations. In one instance, her forces attacked Gibraltar with 5 boats. They netted booty and many hostages. Around 1520, her forces captured a Portuguese governor's wife. So they were just like, no fucks given. She was just like, let's go. So like these are the Barbary corsairs, who were like mostly Islamic people working for Islamic kingdoms. But there's also lots of Christian pirates too, and all of them profited not just from like stealing stuff. I'm trying to avoid saying booty as many times as I can. But all sides. Everybody was also capturing and ransoming their enemies and or selling them as slaves. That's just like what this business was like. So due to the treasure that her corsairs were getting, Tetuan became more and more prosperous because the money went back to like funding that city's development. So she earned money from like literally, getting booty from other people's ships, but she also earned money by negotiating ransoms for Christian prisoners captured. And her reputation spread like into Europe. Leaders were calling for her head. Like she was like well known. Sebastian de Vargas, a Portuguese diplomat based in Fez in Morocco at the time, said that she was a very aggressive and bad-tempered woman about everything, which is like, maybe she was. Frankly, I feel like I'm going to put that on a t-shirt. A very aggressive and bad-tempered woman about everything. He was Portuguese, and like, she was like doing really well bringing down the Portuguese. They had suffered substantial financial losses at her hands. So as per ever, they're just like, oh, she's a woman and she's not nice. Like, yeah. And so what? Another angle to bear in mind about like, was she a pirate? What she was doing was also, in a sense, freedom fighting, like working to protect Morocco from being colonized by the Spanish or the Portuguese. In her book, The Forgotten Queens of Islam, Fatima Mernissi suggests that piracy became a favorite sport of people like Sayyida, who had been displaced from Al-Andalus. This allowed the expelled people to obtain quick revenues, booty, and ransom for captives, and at the same time to continue to fight the Christian enemy. And then another quote. So this is Hasna Lebedi. So many of Sayyida's privateers were Andalusis who settled in places like Tetuan. Under her command, they helped her to fend off the aggressive Iberians who were colonizing Morocco and at times enslaving most of the populations. So Sayyida al-Hurra was doing the same thing to the Iberians as they were doing to the Moroccans. I wouldn't call her a pirate. To refer to her as a pirate is to put the blame on those who were defending their land from aggressive colonial powers. Then again, it's a complex situation. So, yes, she was mostly, almost entirely, attacking Spanish and Portuguese people. She was sort of campaigning against these European Christian forces, and that lends itself to an anti-colonial narrative. And at the same time, Sayyida worked with some European people when it suited her. So I can't imagine she wouldn't have had a personal stake in this of wanting to get revenge against especially the Spanish for what they had done to her and thousands of people. But also she was clever and canny and knew when to sort of back down and side with her enemy against another enemy. But then also, an instance of her quote unquote siding with the enemy is that Tetuan kept trading with do you remember there was on the tippy top of North Africa, there's Ceuta, the Portuguese colony. So Tetuan would trade with them, even though they were Portuguese, because they were a valuable trade partner. But don't discount also that while they were doing Corsair stuff, Sayyida was also doing really well politically as the governor of Tetuan, which would have taken a lot of skill and intelligence and canniness. And this is such a volatile situation she was in, and she seemed to have served very well. So she developed and maintained strong domestic connections even after. So remember, her brother became the vizier to the Sultan of Morocco. So her brother died. Presumably at some point her father died also. Her husband had died. She did not have a man in her corner. So with Dida, where it's I need to have in the absence of a husband, it's she must have had really good male advisors around her, because this was a culture where, although she was respected and allowed to be a leader, she needed to have allies who would help keep her in power. So this and the fact that they weren't backstabbing her or trying to usurp her means that she was choosing good people around her. And even just Tetuan was getting more and more powerful, better funded through all these things she was doing. She was able to keep it going. The whole thing with there was not grain, but clearly that she found ways to rely on trade to get grain and to keep the people there fed and prospering. And that same thing, you remember the part of Dida of Kashmir where it's and then she was the queen for 20 years. So the same sort of literally the same thing happened, where for 20 years, Sayyida was the governor of Tetuan. Tetuan kept doing better and better. And we don't really know about what happened, but the fact that she was not deposed speaks to her political skill, her survival skills, and just the faith and trust the people she governed had in her being in charge. So when she was around 50 years old or so, the Sultan of Morocco, remember, the one who, when she was a teenager, they'd gone to him to ask permission to rebuild Tetuan, and then also her brother worked for him, so they kind of knew each other. Stopped by town as part of, he was kind of touring around trying to get support for his dynasty, which was under threat. So he's just trying to drum up some allies and stuff. So this is interesting because apparently she'd been doing fine for 20 years. But when he proposed marriage, she accepted. Why? I'm not going to say why did he propose marriage. She's great. But why would she have agreed to this after having been a successful widowed, not remarried woman for so long? So potentially she was worried that maybe some threats were gaining power against her and she wanted to have a powerful husband. Maybe she saw that this was a good way to strengthen Tetuan's position, because even though his dynasty wasn't doing great, he was literally the Sultan and in charge of all of Morocco. I don't know. So she agreed to marry him, but so he's do you want to marry me? Bye. He proposed marriage maybe through a letter. I don't know. He was back in Fez by that point. He visited and then he left. And then he's like, do you want to marry me? And she's like, okay, but like, I'm not going to go to Fez. And will you come here to Tetuan and marry me here? And this was unprecedented because there was no other occasion in Moroccan history where the Sultan left where he was to go marry the woman where she was. And I don't think we've seen that in any other culture we've looked at in this podcast yet either. It's always like, if you think about like Henry VIII, not that we did this on the podcast, but like Anne of Cleves, like went to England to marry him. Like everyone always goes, either they have the like proxy wedding and then they like Mary Tudor, Queen of France, went to France. Like the woman always goes to the man in like every story. But in this one, she was like, the man's going to come to me. And he did, which kind of also speaks to the fact that he was maybe really desperate to make this alliance. Anyway, but also perhaps Sayyida didn't want to leave Tetuan because she thought if she like left the city, someone else might like try and usurp it in her absence, or potentially just in sort of like a politically PR way. She wanted to show the people of Tetuan, even though she was going to be the wife of the Sultan and therefore kind of, well, not kind of, like the Queen of Morocco, Tetuan was still her first priority. So the marriage shook her enemies when they found out about it. Like all the way up in Madrid, the Spanish king, who at this point was Philip II, who you might know as the one who married Mary the First of England, and then who Elizabeth had all the naval / privateer battles against. He was really freaked out when he heard that these two had married. Sayyida al-Hurra marrying the Sultan of Morocco was like a mega power couple move, sort of on par. It was kind of like they would be like the Islamic Isabella and Ferdinand level of like power marriage alliance. Like she was so famous and he was a sultan. It's just like, oh shit, like this is like the enemies of Spain just getting this really powerful new connection. So not only was the wedding like the Sultan came to Tetuan to marry her, but it remained a long distance marriage. Sayyida just did not leave Tetuan and he was in Fez, which is interesting and unexpected. And I would suspect also maybe she didn't trust it in her absence. Someone wouldn't try and take over. And I think that partially because a year after the wedding, someone in fact did take over. So a young male relative, and again, all the sources are like, maybe her son-in-law? No one's quite sure what the relationship was. And it's like, where did she get a son-in-law from is a great question. Maybe she had a daughter with her first husband, or maybe she had stepchildren from her marriage. Anyway, a young male relative deposed her. He took over as governor of Tetuan. So whoever this guy was, it does not seem like he had too much trouble getting rid of her. So at this point, her power must, like, clearly she was not as powerful as she had been, or people were, she'd been there for so long, people were like tired of her or something. Why would someone depose her when she was doing great and she was only like 51 years old? Who knows? But one of the reasons could have been like at this point, in retaliation for all of the like attacking of Portuguese ships, the Portuguese government had forbid any commerce between Tetuan and Ceuta, which kind of fucked over Tetuan because that was like their main trade partner. But it's like, would you depose her just for that? Anyway, given that almost everything we know about Sayyida comes from the records of the Spanish and Portuguese who recorded her corsair type activity, we don't know what happened to her after this mysterious younger male relative took over as governor of Tetuan. Even if she wasn't governor of Tetuan, she's still technically the wife of the Sultan of Morocco. So one source suggested maybe she went there to just like be his wife. Some suggest that she just went back to Chefchaouen and just like lived out like her retirement years. Like, I don't know, doing what? Like, I don't know, gardening or something. Or what seems most likely to me, and at least one source suggested this, is that she might have just been executed. Like, I don't think she's the sort of person where they'd be like, we're just going to take over as governor. And she'd be like, great, I'm going to go off and just like do needlepoint for 25 years in retirement. Like, I feel like they knew how powerful she was. And if you're going to usurp her, I think they might have killed her. But we do not know. We do not know when she died or how or why. And then after the end of her reign, the Barbarossa name continued on, and the Barbary Corsairs like continued on for like another 100 years of just like being very successful. During her approximately 30 years as governor, Tetuan became super prosperous, which is part of her legacy. Now it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So Significantly also, Sayyida is also the last Muslim ruler to bear the title al-Hurra, a term used to designate female leaders in the Arab world who held power in their own right. That being said, because of a lack of historical documents, but also a lack of people, I think it's largely a lack of historical documents and a lack of people writing about her at the time, a lack of people researching her now. Not just her, but also women, female corsairs. We don't actually know how unusual it was for a woman to be a corsair, a governor, and a diplomat. Was she an iconoclast, or were other women doing this in other places? Literally, we don't know. But one of the sources I read suggested that in the face of kind of the ongoing crises, like the fall of Granada, all of the people coming to North Africa, sort of the instability of who is in charge of what city and stuff, just that sort of chaos might have left an opening that the previous gender norms could be more easily breached because everything that was going on at this time. And that's similar to how Fredegonde and Brunhild were able to gain power in their era, or how Dida of Kashmir gained control. When things were kind of chaotic, it's gender norms can maybe kind of fall away a bit because you're just we need someone to be governor, and how about her? She seems nice. So again, Tetuan, named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So in terms of significance, that was largely her husband started that, but it was her success, getting money that made the city kind of as prosperous as it was to make it last as long as it did. And now it's recognized internationally. So time to do some scoring. I do not see any candidate, we know so little about who was around her, but I don't see any candidates here for the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance. Wouldst that there were. So the Fredegonde Memorial Scandaliciousness Scale. So scandaliciousness for Sayyida, I feel inherently piracy, being a lady pirate is scandalicious in that delicious sort of way, but it's but was she a pirate? Was she a freedom fighter? Is this in terms of scandaliciousness, it's did she murder anyone? I mean, in her corsair business, maybe, but that's not that's more just being a soldier. That's not murder, heist. Did she poison anybody? Was there any sex scandals? There's very little scandaliciousness, but I am going to give her a 5 just because of the legend of her, and just being allegedly a lady pirate is no less than 5. The word scheminess, I feel, I want to be really clear, especially when we're looking at women from other cultures, cultures that are not Western European. I'm using the word to mean kind of intelligence, cleverness, resiliency. Scheminess is a word that I like in some senses to reclaim, to celebrate women who come up with cool plans. But there's a cultural context to this, or when you're looking at Muslim women, that I want to be really, really clear what I mean. And what I mean about Sayyida is she was so smart, she was so capable, she came up with great plans. She was able to rule for 30 years, which means she was a good leader. And in the sense of this scale, the word we use for that is scheminess. And I think she did a great job. So I'm going to give her an 8. In terms of significance, I think, it's hampered by the fact that there's so little information known about her, but literally she built a city, and the city is still there and it's celebrated. The significance of being the last al-Hurra, and then also being governor for so long, and the effect that had kind of on the Mediterranean and on colonialism and stuff feels quite significant to me. I'm going to give her an 8 for significance. And then the sexism bonus for her is yes, she achieved a lot. The fact that when her husband died and she was I'll be governor now, and everyone's great. That shows a distinct lack of sexism, frankly, that people were okay with her staying on, and she stayed on for 30 years. I mean, she obviously faced sexism in the sense that the Portuguese people would be nah, she's not nice, but that didn't really stop her. I'm going to give her a 6 for sexism. So hang on. If we add that all up, what do we get? We get a 27. So 27 is 1 point higher than Inês de Castro. 27, other people with 27, Isabel of Portugal, Ana de Mendoza, people from the same region where she was from, in the sense of Iberian Peninsula. Margaret Pole has a 27. Ooh, Isabella of Castile, the woman who was responsible for the Muslims being kicked out of Granada, also 27. John de la Motte, 27. This is a popular scholar. Catherine Parr, Francis Gray, 27. Wow, the fact that Sayyida and Isabella both have 27 feels interesting to me. Yeah, so that's this episode. You can check the little website that I did at vulgarhistory.com. I've got more notes there about references and sources. You can find our merch at vulgarhistory.store, vulgarhistory.store. God, what was the thing that the Portuguese person said? Yeah, a very aggressive and bad-tempered woman about everything, 100%. There's going to be merch there that says that on it at vulgarhistory.store. You can support this show at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. That's where you can get the bonus episodes. We have So This Asshole, where I talk about horrible men in history. We've got Vulgar Peace Theater, where I'm joined by Lanoa Johnson and Alison Epstein, and we talk about costume dramas, and that's all there if you just can't get enough of me talking. We're on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, Twitter at Vulgar History, and also on my website. So if you go to vulgarhistory.com, there's the form there where you can suggest people who you think might be good to profile on future episodes. You can also email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. Yeah, that's this episode. I hope you guys are all doing as well as one can in the face of the chaos of the year 2022 / this whole, frankly, century. And I hope that this podcast brings you some distraction and delight. So keep your mask on, keep your tits out. I'll talk to you all next time.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Lauro, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you. We call upon you. In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you. We call upon you. By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world, sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you. We call upon you. On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you. Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.
I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I'm the host and creator of Only One in the Room podcast. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's incredible Only One story. We talk to the realest of real people, dealing with issues like infertility, addiction, human trafficking, and body shaming. Oh, and we want to be fair, so we talk to some celebrities too. Oscar winners, New York Times bestselling authors, supermodels, and even the most decorated U.S. Winter Olympian. Everyone is invited to share their Only One story with our listeners. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone. Download Only One in the Room wherever you listen to podcasts today.